You're listening to the Mezzo Guild podcast.
بس أنا لازم أحسه الأول عشان أقوله.
아직 나의 어색한 한국말이 짤따рат하고 지적하지 말아주세요.
Я хочу с тобой серьезно поговорить.
Great, get his photograph. No, I can quit this Modena, so here, sure.
Language learning, made simple. If you head over to the UK or Ireland, you'll find that you only have to travel an hour or less down the road, and you'll find people speaking a totally different dialect of English to the town that you were just in. Now compare that to the enormous island continent of Australia, where you can fly 4 to 5 hours from Brisbane to Perth, and there's no noticeable difference in the way that people talk. That's East Coast to West Coast. Even North America has vastly different dialects depending on where you are. But Australia is different. Now, it's generally accepted that there are three main types of Australian English. There's the general type, there's broad, and there's cultivated. These are not regional dialects, however. They're not geographically defined dialects. They have more to do with the person's socioeconomic status or group affiliation than anything else. Now, instead of talking about the boring stuff, the phonology and structure, I'm going to share a couple of examples, a couple of samples so you can hear the difference. Now, general Australian English, general English, is the most common type, and it's what we would consider to be a neutral accent in Australia. For us Aussies, someone speaking this variety doesn't really have any accent at all, and most of the population tends to speak it. A good example of this is Hugh Jackman, aka Wolverine. Here's a sample of him speaking.
So we drove there, we worked the first day. Sunset came, they said, okay, Hugh, car's ready, you better go because we've got to get you back next morning. And I said, I'm not going. And they said, what? I said, I'm just staying here. And about 2 months later, I never left the set.
Really?
No, I just stayed in my trailer. My son stayed with me most of the time. My wife would come out in and out.
Now, the broad type is what we're famous for. It's also often regarded as the language of the uneducated working class, or bogans. All the stereotypes and cliches that float around in other countries about Australians are pretty much based on this one accent. And the best example of this is Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter.
And let them run up my mission. Because that's what I did for my mum and dad, and I'm really proud to tell you that. By crikey, I got tears flowing out, and I'm holding them back. I'm trying so hard to hold them back, but I'm just doing what they wanted me to do. They created a wildlife warrior. I am that. And they were able to stand aside to varying degrees.
And finally, there's cultivated, the cultivated type. Now, people with a quasi-British accent, or what I like to call the haughty-tawty Melbourne types. Now, a good example of this one is Geoffrey Rush.
Hans Huberman is, I think, on the surface, or when you first meet him, a relatively, and for me as an actor, a very unadorned, quite simple guy. He's a house painter. He does some sign writing, but there's not a lot of work around because the economy's not strong.
Aussies shorten just about everything. We're experts at doing this, especially those of us with a broad accent. Take a listen to this.
The Savo, me and my mates from Rochi are getting together to have a barbie and watch the footy. Laz and Smitty will be there. Oh shit, I gotta go pay me rego. I'll stop at the servo on the way and pick up some ciggies.
These are called diminutives, when words get shortened, and in the case of Aussie English, almost always end with a vowel. So a few examples, the name Rochdale, which is where I went to school, Rochi, afternoon, arvo, barbecue, barbie, football, footy, Larry, Laz, Smith, Smitty, registration, rego, service station, servo, cigarettes, ciggies. And my name Donovan, actually my friends back home call me Dono, and my family calls me Donnie. I rarely ever hear people call me by my whole name. Now, I'm not exactly sure why these diminutives exist in Australian English, but Kel Richards from the ABC back home came up with 3 good possible reasons. The first being verbal playfulness. I'll read a quote. He says, verbal playfulness, the English-speaking colonies in Australia were planted by folk from all over the British Isles, speaking many different dialects. Thus, thrust into close contact with each other, they became extremely sensitive to language differences. And from this, I would suggest, much given to verbal playfulness, Aussie English remains highly inventive and colourful, and diminutives are but one example of this. 2. Informality. Australia has a particularly informal culture. There is far more linguistic formality, for example, in the deep south of the US, where people can still be addressed as sir and ma'am, even by other adults. Australia, by way of contrast, is, as one person once observed, a country where everyone expects to address their doctor by their first name. The heavy use of diminutives is one linguistic expression of Aussie informality. And 3. Group solidarity. By using Aussie diminutives, we are signalling our membership in the club of Aussiness. And by addressing you with other diminutives, we're including you in our club as well. Group jargon defines the group. If English speakers from overseas don't understand our diminutives, well, that's just because they're not us. So how the bloody hell did Aussie English come about anyway? Here's an interesting snippet from English in Australia and New Zealand by Kate Burridge and Jean Mulder. It goes, much discussion has focused on the origins of Oz and New Zealand pronunciation, and at times the speculations have been wild. Some have maintained that these accents are caused by climate, by a national nose inflammation as a result of pollen or hay, and even by fear of opening the mouth on account of flies or dust. Other accounts look to carelessness, laziness, some kind of gross national inferiority complex, a freewheeling and adventurous spirit, or an outlaw heritage. Even ill-fitting dentures have been suggested as a likely cause. Now, these are actual theories. They go on to say that there are 2 main theories about the origin of Aussie English. 1, a mixture of regional accents from Britain and Ireland that kind of melted together and became what it is today. And 2, mainly descended from Cockney English. Hello, governor. Now, as you probably know, unless you've never been to school or grew up under a rock somewhere, Australia was founded as a penal colony of Great Britain. What this basically means is that their jails were jam-packed and they needed somewhere to send their criminals. And since North America wasn't accepting criminals in the late 1700s, they were sent down to Australia. It wasn't considered a holiday destination back in those days. Now, Cockneys were the lower scumbag class of London, and the Irish were arrested for pretty much anything. They only had to sneeze near an Englishman and they'd be put on a boat to Australia. Now, if you ever get a chance to go to Ireland, make sure to check out the Wicklow Historic Jail. It's about an hour or 2 south of Dublin, and read the curses that the Irish prisoners scratched into the walls of their cells for being sentenced to 8 years in Australia. And 8 years back then was actually a life sentence because they never actually were able to come home. That place should be a pilgrimage spot for every Aussie, in my opinion. It was an emotional experience when I went there. But I'd like to highlight 3 really distinct influences on our English. 1, the Cockneys, 2, the Irish, and 3, the Australian Aborigines. If you were to sit down and take a good hard look at the vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation of Aussie English, then these sources really stand out. Okay, so the Cockneys, I'm sure that like every language and dialect, Cockney has evolved somewhat over time, so you can't really make an accurate comparison here, but take a listen to this modern-day Cockney accent. This is a sample taken from one of my favourite films, Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels.
What's this Eddie like then?
He's a fucking thief.
Harry has a colleague, a monster of a man, Barry the Baptist. The Baptist got his name by drowning people for hatchets.
Are you gonna fucking pay? Are you gonna fucking pay?
Barry makes sure the administrative side of the business runs harmoniously.
The boy's got a rare ability. He seems to make cards transparent. He's got bluff.
All right, so we can say he's good.
Oh no, he's better than good. He's a fucking liability.
Now, there are a few things for you to listen to in this clip. Like most British English dialects, Cockney is non-rhotic. And what this means is that unlike Americans, Canadians, and Irish, they don't pronounce the R unless there's a vowel in front of it. So, for example, the word car sounds like car. Australian English is very non-rhotic variety. just like Cockney in this regard. Sometimes the letter T is replaced by a glottal stop. This is where air is momentarily stopped, causing something like a little speed bump in your speech. For example, shortage instead of shortage. You got it all. You got it all. You got it all. In Aussie English, we do occasionally do this, but not as much. For example, he was hitting the ball. He was hitting the ball. Instead of saying he was hitting the ball, we say he was hitting the ball. Usually the T just sort of sounds like a D though. For example, instead of saying shithouse, you'd say shithouse. Shithouse. It'd sound like a D. In the shithouse example, just there, you'll notice that the H is silent. So instead of shit house or shit house, you just say shithouse. Shithouse. Notice how the Cockneys say ease instead of he's, he is. Ease. The TH sound is often replaced by an F or a V in Cockney. So, he's a fucking thief. He says, he's a fucking thief. Nothing instead of nothing. Nothing. Occasionally, but not as often, you'll encounter this kind of stuff in Australian English. And see how the guy gets referred to as, the Barry gets referred to as Bazza. Bazza. This is what I was talking about before with diminutives. We're renowned for this. Now, the Irish. Because the Irish English dialects, Hiberno English they're called, are rhotic, the influence of the Irish on Australian English isn't as obvious as the British are, but it's important to note that in the late 1700s and early 1800s, most Irish people actually spoke Irish Gaelic, or they spoke English as their second language. This means that most of the Irish prisoners who were sent to Australia probably spoke Irish as their first and possibly only language, and thus their children would have been forced to learn a British variety growing up. It goes without saying that Gaelic has influenced the vocabulary of Aussie English along with plenty of place names across Australia, being the same as towns and villages back in Ireland. For example, I come from Queensland, where we have places like Innisfail, Clontarf, Cloncurry, Enniskillen, Donnybrook, just to name a few. And a really common word in Australian English is tucker for food. It means food. But it actually comes from the Irish word tucker. From this, we actually created the word tuck shop, which is basically a school cafeteria. We say shut your gob, which is an Irish word that means beak, as in the beak of a bird. Gob is used here to mean mouth. We say things like, I've got the gift of the gab. Gab is another Irish word that means speech or talk. We say someone has the gift of the gab when they're talkative, or very sociable, or a good liar. You've no doubt heard of blokes and Sheilas. Well, Sheila is a common female name in Ireland. One really important and not researched enough in my opinion contribution made by the Irish to Aussie English is the way that Irish culture shaped the way that we use our language. The laid-back egalitarian culture where everybody, young, old, wealthy, poor, local, foreign, are all mate. Along with our jovial nature, although the culture has been changing, there's this general rule that everybody is on par with each other, and there's no respect for snobs. Now, a theory that I've read and tend to agree with is that it goes back to the days of the Irish settlers in Australia battling to survive the harsh conditions of Australia and the English crown. Even today, this working-class battler status is revered by us as sacred. And one of our most famous songs by Jimmy Barnesy, is a song called "Working Class Man," and this really shows you just what it means to Australia. Now, contrast this, of course, with the English, with the classism that exists in England and still exists in England to this day, and you'll see what I mean. And then there's, of course, the Australian Aborigines. Now, sadly, hundreds of Australian Aboriginal languages have been lost over the last 2 centuries, with many more currently endangered, but they've been a huge influence on the development of Aussie English, and about 1/3 of all place names in Australia are Aboriginal names. A few examples from the area that I come from are Coombaba, Narang, Tambourine, which is an Aboriginal word from the Ugamba language, not the musical instrument in English, Wurundjeri, Mudgeeraba, Kanungra. Absolutely everywhere you go in Australia, you'll see places like this. Now, most of our animal names are Aboriginal too. Koala, kangaroo, wallaby, kookaburra, barramundi, dingo. One really common expression that you'll hear in Queensland especially is hard yakka. This word yakka was a word for work by the Yagara or Jagara people around what's now Brisbane. And we've even got a work clothing brand named after it, hard yakka. Some Aboriginal communities today also speak Creoles, which are basically hybrid languages where English and local language have kind of mixed together. They can't really be understood by English speakers, though. Now, if you ever get a chance, I really recommend that you check out a movie called 10 Canoes, which is scripted entirely in the dialects of the Yolngu people. And if, like me, you're passionate about language revival and you have an interest in Australian Aboriginal languages, then consider helping out programs like ARDS. That's ards.com.au. So I believe it's the best variety of English on earth. I believe it's the most interesting, the most colourful, and it really has the most fascinating history.